date is July 14th, 1789. The cobblestones of Paris are slick with summer rain and something darker. A crowd has gathered outside the Bastille fortress, not the organized march of a political demonstration, but something wilder, angrier, the kind of gathering that forms when years of frustration finally find a target. Inside the fortress walls, Governor Delaunay peers through a window at the sea of faces below. He commands just 82 invalids and 32 Swiss guards. The crowd numbers in the thousands. They want gunpowder. They want symbols of royal oppression torn down. They want everything to change. By evening, Delaunay's head will be mounted on a pike. The Bastille will be rubble. And something that began as a demand for bread and representation will have crossed a line from which there is no return. But here is what no one in that crowd could have imagined as they stormed the gates. Within 15 years, France would crown an emperor whose power would dwarf any king they had just overthrown. The revolution that promised to end tyranny would birth a tyrant. The movement that declared all men equal would create a new aristocracy of merit that looked remarkably like the old aristocracy of birth. This is not unique to France. It is not even unusual. Across history, across continents, revolutions follow a pattern so consistent it seems almost scripted. The oppressed rise up. The old order falls. New leaders emerge promising a radically different world, and then, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the new world begins to resemble the old one. Why? Why do revolutions born from the burning desire to create something entirely different so often end up recreating the very systems they sought to destroy? Is it a failure of imagination? A betrayal of ideals? Or is there something deeper at work? Something in the nature of power itself that pulls even the most idealistic movements back toward familiar patterns? This question haunts every age of upheaval. It haunted the American colonists as they watched their revolution birth a new nation. It haunted the Russian revolutionaries as they watched their workers' paradise become a different kind of empire. And it haunts us today, in an era when the word revolution is thrown around with casual frequency, when every social movement promises to change everything, because if revolutions tend to recreate what they replace, what does that mean for change itself? What does it mean for the possibility of genuine transformation? I'm here to explore this pattern with you, and this is Cycles Decoded. Before we continue deeper into this question that has puzzled historians and philosophers for centuries, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this work reach others who, like you, are searching for understanding in the quiet hours when the day's noise has faded. I'm genuinely curious where you're joining me from tonight. Are you falling asleep in London, letting these questions settle into your thoughts? Settling in Singapore for the night, where the city lights are dimming? On a late shift in São Paulo? Winding down with something that makes you think? There's something profound about knowing we're simultaneously exploring this ancient pattern across time zones, across continents. Share where you're from in the comments. It actually matters to me. And now, let the busy world fade. Let your shoulders drop. There's nowhere you need to be right now except here, listening. What we're about to explore together reaches back through centuries of human struggle, yet it speaks to questions that feel urgently present. Let us journey into the heart of revolutionary change and discover why transformation is far more complex than anyone in that Paris crowd could have imagined. The men who gathered in the tennis court at Versailles on June 20th, 1789, were not radicals. They were lawyers, merchants, priests, respectable members of the Third Estate who had come to discuss tax reform and representation. They took an oath that day, swearing not to disband until France had a new constitution. It was, by any measure, a moderate demand. But revolutions have their own momentum. What begins as reform becomes rebellion. What starts as rebellion becomes upheaval. And what emerges from upheaval, well, that is where the pattern reveals itself. Within months, those moderate voices were drowned out by more radical ones. Maximilien Robespierre, a provincial lawyer who had once opposed the death penalty, became the architect of the terror. The revolution that began with demands for representation became a machine that consumed its own children. Between 1793 and 1794, the guillotine claimed over 16,000 lives, including many of the revolution's original leaders. This acceleration is not accidental. It is built into the revolutionary process itself. When the old order collapses, it creates what historians call a power vacuum, an empty space where authority used to exist. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Someone must make decisions, someone must organize the new society. Someone must decide who belongs and who doesn't, who gets rewarded and who gets punished. In the chaos of revolutionary change, these decisions fall to whoever can seize them most effectively. The Jacobins understood this. While other factions debated theory, they organized. They built networks, they positioned themselves to fill the vacuum, and when the moment came, they were ready. Not because they were the most popular or the most representative, but because they were the most organized. But here is where the pattern becomes visible. The tools they used to consolidate power were remarkably similar to the tools of the old regime: surveillance networks to watch for enemies of the state, revolutionary tribunals that functioned much like royal courts, a committee of public safety that wielded executive power more absolutely than any king. The rhetoric was different, the justifications were different, but the mechanisms of control, those remained familiar. Consider Robespierre himself. The man who had once argued that virtue could govern without force became convinced that terror was virtue's instrument. In his mind, he was still serving the revolution, still fighting for equality and justice, but the revolution now required enemies to be eliminated, dissent to be crushed, purity to be enforced. The revolution was eating itself and calling it progress. By 1794, even Robespierre's allies had grown exhausted by the endless executions. The Thermidorian reaction, named for the revolutionary calendar month when it occurred, swept him from power and onto the scaffold. The terror was over. The revolution, it seemed, was returning to sanity. But what emerged was not the moderate republic the original revolutionaries had envisioned. It was something else entirely, a directory that governed through corruption and military force. A system so unstable that when a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte offered order, the French people welcomed him with open arms. And Napoleon understood power in ways the idealistic revolutionaries never had. He kept the revolutionary rhetoric. He maintained the symbols of equality. He even preserved many of the revolution's legal and administrative reforms, but he wrapped them in imperial purple and crowned himself Emperor of the French. The revolution that had begun with the execution of a king ended with the coronation of an emperor. The movement that had declared hereditary nobility an abomination created a new nobility based on merit and loyalty to Napoleon. The uprising that had promised to free humanity from tyranny produced a tyrant whose armies would march across Europe for the next decade. This was not betrayal, exactly. Napoleon genuinely believed he was fulfilling the revolution's promise. He was spreading its ideals across the continent, breaking down feudal barriers, establishing legal equality, creating careers open to talent rather than birth. The Napoleonic Code, which codified many revolutionary principles, would influence legal systems worldwide. Yet the structure of power, the relationship between ruler and ruled, the mechanisms of control and obedience, these had been restored. Different in detail perhaps, but familiar in essence. Why does this happen? Why do revolutions born from the desire to create something radically new so often circle back to variations of what came before? February 1917. The Tsar has abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, 3 centuries old, crumbles in a matter of days. In the streets of Petrograd, revolutionary crowds tear down imperial eagles, burn portraits of Nicholas II, storm the symbols of autocracy. The old world is dead, or so it seems. But walk into any government building in those chaotic weeks, and you'll find something curious. The same clerks sit at the same desks. The same filing systems organize the same paperwork. The same procedures govern the same bureaucratic processes. The faces at the top have changed. The machinery beneath continues to turn. This is the paradox that haunts every revolution. The most dramatic political upheavals in history, moments when entire worldviews are supposedly overturned, often leave the deeper structures of power remarkably intact, and nowhere is this more visible than in the persistence of bureaucracy. Consider what happened in Russia after 1917. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in October, promised to smash the old state apparatus completely. Lenin himself had written that the bourgeois state must be broken up and replaced with something entirely new. Yet within months, the revolutionaries found themselves relying on the very administrative systems they had sworn to destroy. Why? The answer lies in a truth that revolutionary leaders discover only after they take power. Running a modern state requires millions of small decisions every day. Who gets paid? Which trains run? How are taxes collected? Where do supplies go? These questions don't pause for revolution, they demand immediate answers from people who actually know how the systems work. The Bolsheviks faced this reality almost immediately. They had spent years planning the overthrow of Tsarism, but virtually no time learning how to manage a bureaucracy of hundreds of thousands of civil servants. Most revolutionary leaders were intellectuals, exiles, or underground organizers. They could write manifestos and organize strikes, but they had never run a ministry or managed a budget or coordinated supply chains across 11 time zones. So they made a pragmatic choice. They kept the existing administrative structure and simply changed who controlled it. The same departments that had served the Tsar now served the Soviet state. The same hierarchical chains of command that had enforced imperial decrees now enforced revolutionary ones. Even the physical offices remained the same, down to the heavy wooden desks and filing cabinets that had organized Tsarist paperwork. This wasn't a betrayal of revolutionary principles, it was a recognition of institutional reality. Bureaucracies are among the most resilient human creations. They survive regime changes because they serve a function that transcends ideology. They process information, coordinate resources, and maintain continuity when everything else is in flux. Revolutionary leaders may hate them in theory, but they cannot govern without them in practice. The Soviet case reveals this pattern with striking clarity. By the 1920s, Lenin's government had created a bureaucratic apparatus that was, in many ways, more centralized and controlling than what the Tsars had ever achieved. The same tendency toward top-down command that had characterized imperial administration now served socialist planning. The same culture of hierarchy and procedure that had frustrated Russian reformers for centuries now frustrated Soviet reformers in remarkably similar ways. Lenin himself recognized this uncomfortable truth. In 1922, he complained bitterly about the Soviet bureaucracy, calling it a survival of the past that was absolutely alien and hostile to revolutionary goals. But he also acknowledged that the Bolsheviks had no choice but to work with the administrative apparatus they had inherited. "We took over the old machinery of state," he admitted, "and that was our misfortune." This pattern extends far beyond Russia. The French Revolution promised to sweep away centuries of royal administration, yet Napoleon's empire relied heavily on bureaucratic structures that dated back to Louis XIV. The Chinese communists vowed to eliminate the Mandarin system, yet Mao's government reproduced many of the same hierarchical patterns that had governed imperial China. Revolutionary movements consistently discover that destroying old institutions is far easier than creating new ones from scratch. There are exceptions, of course. The Cuban Revolution managed to dismantle much of Batista's administrative apparatus and build something genuinely different, though it took decades of economic struggle and international isolation to achieve this transformation. Even then, Cuba eventually developed its own entrenched bureaucratic culture that frustrated later reform efforts. The deeper lesson here is about the nature of institutional change itself. Bureaucracies persist not because they are particularly efficient or beloved, but because they represent accumulated knowledge about how complex societies function. Every filing system contains information about how resources flow. Every procedure embodies lessons learned from past mistakes. Every hierarchy reflects practical necessities about coordination and accountability. Revolutionary leaders often underestimate this institutional knowledge because they focus on the political purposes that bureaucracies serve rather than the technical functions they perform. They see the apparatus of oppression but they miss the apparatus of administration. They understand that bureaucracies can be tools of control, but they don't fully grasp that they are also tools of coordination. This creates a cruel irony. The very movements that promise the most radical change often end up recreating the systems they sought to replace simply because they lack viable alternatives. The revolution succeeds in changing who holds power, but it fails to change how power operates on a day-to-day basis. And so the pattern repeats. New leaders sit in old chairs, using old procedures to implement new policies. The revolutionary moment passes, but the bureaucratic momentum continues. The forms change, the rhetoric transforms, the ideology shifts, but the fundamental architecture of administration endures, shaping the new regime in ways its founders never intended. This is not cynicism about revolutionary change, it is realism about institutional persistence. Understanding why bureaucracies survive regime changes helps us understand why revolutions so often disappoint their most ardent supporters. The problem is not that revolutionary leaders betray their principles, it is that institutional realities constrain even the most principled leaders in ways they rarely anticipate. Tehran, February 1979, the streets overflow with celebration. Students who had read Marx and Fanon march alongside clerics who had studied centuries of Islamic jurisprudence. Banners in Farsi and English proclaim freedom from the Shah's oppression. Western journalists capture scenes of unveiled women standing beside chador-clad mothers, all united in their hatred of imperial rule. In those intoxicating weeks, the Iranian Revolution seemed to promise something unprecedented, a fusion of socialist ideals with authentic cultural identity, liberation from both Western imperialism and religious orthodoxy. Yet within 3 years, many of those same students would find themselves in prison. The women who had marched unveiled would be forced to cover their hair by law. The revolution that had promised to break all chains would forge new ones, often more restrictive than what came before. This transformation reveals something profound about revolutionary ideology itself. Ideas that begin as tools of liberation often become instruments of control. The very passion that drives people to risk everything for change can calcify into rigid doctrine once power is won. Consider Ayatollah Khomeini in those early months. His speeches from exile in Paris had been carefully crafted for Western ears. He spoke of democracy, of women's rights, of a pluralistic society free from tyranny. French intellectuals like Michel Foucault praised his vision of spiritual politics. Khomeini seemed to offer something genuinely new, a third way between Soviet materialism and American capitalism. But ideology, once it tastes power, begins to change. What starts as a critique of existing systems must transform into a blueprint for governing, and governing requires certainty, hierarchy, the ability to make decisions that millions will follow. The questioning spirit that fueled the revolution becomes a liability when you need to run a country. Khomeini understood this transition instinctively. Within months of the Shah's departure, he began consolidating power around a single interpretation of Islamic governance. The Revolutionary Guard, initially formed to protect the revolution from counterattack, became the enforcers of ideological purity. Universities were purged of professors whose thinking was deemed insufficiently Islamic. The press, briefly free, found itself subject to new forms of censorship. The pattern is remarkably consistent across revolutionary movements. The Bolsheviks, who had promised to smash the state apparatus, created a bureaucracy more extensive than the Tsars had ever imagined. The Chinese communists, who had rallied peasants against feudal hierarchy, established their own rigid social order with party membership determining life chances. The Iranian revolutionaries, who had condemned the Shah's secret police, created the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. This is not simply hypocrisy, though hypocrisy certainly plays a role. It is something deeper, the way that revolutionary ideas must adapt to the practical demands of power. Every ideology that successfully overthrows a system faces the same challenge. How do you govern a complex society with the same ideas that you used to tear down the previous order? The Iranian case is particularly instructive because the transformation happens so quickly and completely. In 1978, Khomeini's followers included secular nationalists, leftist students, liberal professionals, and traditional merchants. By 1982, most of these groups had been marginalized or eliminated from positions of influence. The revolution had not been captured by conservatives, it had become conservative. Watch how the language shifted. Early revolutionary proclamations spoke of justice, equality, liberation from oppression. These are inherently destabilizing concepts. They invite people to question, to demand, to imagine alternatives. But once the revolutionaries held power, the emphasis moved to order, tradition, obedience to divine law. The very words that had mobilized millions were quietly retired in favor of terms that encouraged submission. Khomeini himself embodied this transition. The man who had been a revolutionary critic of established authority became the ultimate authority figure. His interpretation of Islamic law became unquestionable. Dissent, which had been heroic under the Shah, became treason under the Islamic Republic. The revolutionary leader had become what he had once opposed, an autocrat whose word was law. Yet this pattern is not universal, and therein lies an important complexity. Vietnam offers a different model. The Communist Party that drove out first the French and then the Americans has maintained political control for decades. But unlike Iran, Vietnamese ideology proved more flexible. By the 1980s, the same party that had preached socialist orthodoxy was embracing market reforms. They called it Doi More Renovation, and it allowed them to adapt their governing philosophy without abandoning their political monopoly. The difference may lie in how these ideologies understood themselves. Vietnamese communism, perhaps because it had been forged in decades of warfare, retained a pragmatic core. Survival mattered more than doctrinal purity. Iranian revolutionary ideology, by contrast, was deeply theological. It claimed access to eternal truths that could not be compromised without betraying the revolution itself. This theological dimension helps explain why the Iranian transformation was so complete. When your ideology claims divine sanction, questioning becomes not just political dissent but spiritual rebellion. The revolutionary clerics did not see themselves as politicians making pragmatic choices, they saw themselves as implementing God's will on earth. Such certainty leaves little room for the kind of flexibility that might preserve revolutionary ideals while adapting to governing realities. So the cycle completes itself. The revolution that began with students questioning authority ends with those same students forbidden to question. The movement that promised liberation creates new forms of control. The ideology that was once radical becomes the foundation of a conservative order that its original adherents might barely recognize. This is perhaps the deepest irony of revolutionary politics. The very success of a revolutionary ideology, its ability to inspire people to risk everything for change, may be what ensures it will eventually become a force for stasis. The passion that destroys the old world often hardens into the dogma that preserves the new one. Beijing, October 1st, 1949. Mao Zedong stands atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace, looking out over Tiananmen Square. The crowd below stretches beyond sight, tens of thousands of faces turned upward, waiting. When he speaks, his voice carries across the square through loudspeakers. The Chinese people have stood up. The old order is dead, the imperial system gone, the Kuomintang defeated, the foreign powers expelled. And yet, within months, a new hierarchy would emerge, new titles, new privileges, new walls between the rulers and the ruled. This is perhaps the most unsettling pattern in revolutionary history, the speed with which new elites crystallize from the chaos of overthrown systems. It happens so consistently, across such different cultures and centuries, that it suggests something fundamental about how power reorganizes itself when existing structures collapse. Consider what happened in those first years after the communist victory. The Chinese Communist Party, which had fought as guerrillas in caves and mountains, suddenly found itself governing nearly a quarter of humanity. Party leaders who had shared meager rations now moved into the former palaces of warlords and foreign administrators. They wore simple uniforms, spoke the language of equality, yet they alone decided policy. They alone had access to information. They alone could travel freely between cities. Mao himself embodied this transformation. The son of a relatively prosperous farmer, he had spent decades as a revolutionary outsider, sleeping in peasant huts, organizing workers, writing manifestos against privilege and hierarchy, but by 1950 he lived in Zhongnanhai, the former Imperial Garden compound in Beijing. His residence was larger than most villages, his security detail numbered in the hundreds. When he wanted to travel, entire train lines were cleared. The man who had written passionately about the corruption of power now wielded it absolutely. This was not hypocrisy exactly. It was something more structural, more inevitable. Revolutionary movements require leadership. They need people capable of making swift decisions under pressure, of inspiring loyalty, of coordinating complex operations across vast distances. These skills are rare, and when the revolution succeeds, these same people find themselves uniquely positioned to shape the new order. The Chinese case reveals how this process unfolds in practice. In the early 1950s, the Communist Party began what it called rectification campaigns, systematic purges of officials deemed insufficiently loyal or ideologically pure. On paper, these campaigns were about maintaining revolutionary principles. In reality, they consolidated power around Mao and his closest allies, local leaders who had joined the revolution early, who had genuine grassroots support, found themselves accused of rightist tendencies or bourgeois thinking. Many were stripped of their positions, some were imprisoned, others simply disappeared. By 1957, the party that had once proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat had become, in practice, the dictatorship of the party elite. And within that elite, a smaller circle held real power, and within that circle, one man's word had become law. The Cultural Revolution, beginning in 1966, took this logic to its extreme. Mao launched what he called a campaign against the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Students formed Red Guard units and attacked teachers, intellectuals, party officials, anyone associated with the previous order. But the revolution devoured its own children. Red Guard leaders who became too independent found themselves targeted by newer, more loyal Red Guard factions. The chaos eventually became so complete that Mao had to call in the army to restore order. And when the dust settled, his personal authority was more absolute than ever. This pattern, the revolutionary leader who becomes the new autocrat, appears across continents and centuries. Robespierre during the French Revolution, Stalin after Lenin's death, Castro in Cuba, Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Each began as a genuine opponent of tyranny. Each ended as the architect of a new form of it. Yet the pattern is not universal. South Africa's transition from apartheid offers a striking counterexample. When the African National Congress came to power in 1994, Nelson Mandela could have ruled for life. The ANC had the political capital, the international support, the overwhelming mandate from the black majority. Instead, Mandela served one term and stepped down. He insisted on democratic institutions, on power-sharing arrangements, on constitutional limits that would constrain his own authority. The difference was not moral superiority, though Mandela's personal character certainly mattered. The difference was context. South Africa's transition happened in the 1990s under intense international scrutiny, with strong civil society organizations already in place. The ANC leaders had spent decades in exile, exposed to democratic movements worldwide. They understood that legitimacy in the modern world required more than revolutionary credentials. But even South Africa illustrates the persistence of elite reproduction. 29 years after apartheid's end, the ANC remains dominated by a relatively small group of liberation-era leaders and their protégés. Economic inequality has actually increased since 1994. The party that fought for freedom has become, in many ways, a vehicle for a new black elite to accumulate wealth and influence. This suggests something uncomfortable about revolutionary change, that it may be less about eliminating hierarchy than about rotating it. The Chinese communists replaced the landlords and foreign businessmen with party cadres. The Russian Bolshevists replaced the aristocrats and capitalists with commissars and apparatchiks. In each case, the new elite justified their privilege through ideology. They were the vanguard of the proletariat, the guardians of revolutionary purity, the servants of the people.
But privilege has its own logic. Once established, it seeks to perpetuate itself. The children of party leaders attend the best schools. They make the most useful connections.
They inherit not titles but access, the informal networks that determine who rises and who falls in any system. Perhaps this is why revolutionary societies so often develop elaborate rituals of egalitarianism, the identical uniforms, the collective slogans, the public displays of simple living. These rituals serve to obscure the reality of new hierarchies forming beneath the surface. They allow the new elite to exercise power while maintaining the fiction that power has been abolished. The tragedy is not that revolutions fail to create perfect equality. No society has ever achieved that. The tragedy is that they so often recreate the very patterns of domination they set out to destroy, while convincing themselves and others that they have done the opposite. September 11th, 1973, Santiago, Chile. The presidential palace burns as military jets circle overhead. Inside, Salvador Allende speaks his final words into a radio microphone, knowing that his democratic socialist experiment is ending not by the will of the Chilean people, but by the calculated intervention of a foreign power thousands of miles away. This is the moment when revolution meets the cold reality of external force, when the dreams of change collide with the interests of distant capitals, and when we see, perhaps most clearly, why so many revolutions end up recreating the very systems they sought to destroy. The Chilean coup was not spontaneous. For 3 years, the CIA had funneled millions of dollars to destabilize Allende's government. They funded opposition newspapers, supported striking truck drivers, and cultivated military officers who would eventually turn their guns on democracy itself. The revolution that had brought Allende to power through the ballot box was crushed by foreign intervention and replaced with a military dictatorship that would serve American economic interests for the next 17 years. But Chile was not unique. Across Latin America throughout the Cold War, revolutionary movements found themselves caught between two superpowers, each determined to shape the outcome according to their own vision of how the world should work. Consider Nicaragua in 1979. The Sandinista revolution overthrew the brutal Somoza dictatorship with genuine popular support. The revolutionaries spoke of land reform, literacy campaigns, and breaking free from foreign domination. Yet within months, they found themselves forced to choose sides in a global conflict they had not started. The Soviet Union offered weapons and economic aid, but with strings attached. Cuban advisors arrived to help organize the new government along socialist lines. Meanwhile, the United States began funding the Contras, a counter-revolutionary force that would wage war against the Sandinistas for nearly a decade. What happened to the Sandinista dream? Gradually, inexorably, it transformed. The need to fight an American-backed insurgency meant adopting the hierarchical structures of a military state. The need for Soviet aid meant accepting economic models designed in Moscow, not Managua. The revolution that had promised to break free from foreign control found itself more dependent on external powers than ever before. This pattern repeats across continents and decades. Revolutionary movements, no matter how genuine their initial vision, discover that they cannot survive in isolation. They need weapons, they need money, they need international recognition, and those who provide these necessities always demand something in return. The demands are rarely explicit. No foreign power announces that they are reshaping a revolution to serve their interests. Instead, the pressure comes through economic dependency, through the threat of invasion, through the promise of aid that comes with subtle conditions attached. Take the economic dimension alone. A revolutionary government that has just overthrown a capitalist system still needs to trade with the world. It needs foreign currency to import essential goods. It needs international banks to process transactions, and that world economy is still fundamentally capitalist. Even the most committed socialist revolution discovers that it must engage with global markets on their terms. It must produce goods that foreign buyers want. It must maintain exchange rates that make trade possible. It must service debts inherited from the previous regime. Step by step, the revolutionary economy begins to look remarkably similar to what came before. The Cold War made this dynamic even more pronounced. Both superpowers treated revolutionary movements as proxies in their global struggle. The United States saw every leftist revolution as a Soviet threat. The Soviet Union viewed every anti-colonial movement as a potential ally. Neither superpower was particularly interested in what the revolutionaries themselves actually wanted. This created a cruel irony. Revolutions that began as assertions of national independence ended up as battlegrounds for foreign influence. The very act of seeking external support to survive meant surrendering the autonomy that revolution had promised to achieve. Yet there are exceptions that prove the rule. Vietnam successfully resisted both French colonial rule and American intervention, but at an enormous cost. Millions died in decades of warfare. The country was devastated, and even Vietnam's ultimate victory came only through extensive support from China and the Soviet Union, support that shaped the revolution's trajectory in ways that persist today. The Vietnamese example reveals both the possibility and the price of resistance. It can be done. A revolutionary movement can maintain its independence against overwhelming external pressure, but the cost is so high that few societies are willing or able to pay it. Most revolutionary movements faced with this impossible choice choose survival over purity. They accept the foreign aid, the military advisors, the economic partnerships that come with hidden conditions. They tell themselves that these are temporary compromises, that once the revolution is secure, they will reclaim their independence. But by then, the structures are already in place. The economic relationships have been established, the military hierarchies have been created. The revolutionary government discovers that it has become dependent on the very systems it once sought to overthrow. This is not a story of betrayal or weakness. It is a story of the constraints that external forces place on internal change. Revolutionary leaders are not naive. They understand the compromises they are making, but they also understand that a revolution that cannot survive will achieve nothing at all. The tragedy lies not in the choice itself, but in how few real choices external pressure leaves available. When foreign powers can strangle a revolution economically, militarily, or diplomatically, the space for genuine alternatives shrinks dramatically. And so we return to our central question: why do revolutions so often recreate the systems they replace? External forces provide part of the answer, not because foreign powers are uniquely evil, but because they are powerful, and because power, once established, tends to reproduce itself across borders and through time. The revolutionary dream of complete transformation crashes against the reality of an interconnected world where no nation, no matter how determined, can truly stand alone. And in that collision, the familiar patterns reassert themselves, wearing new flags but serving old masters. Perhaps this is what makes the cycle of revolution and continuity so enduring. The forces that shape it extend far beyond any single society, any single moment of change. They are woven into the very structure of how power operates in our interconnected world. If this exploration of external forces and their role in shaping revolutions has resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this work reach others who are searching to understand these same patterns of power and change in our complex world. I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts on this. Have you witnessed how external pressures shape change in your own community or country? What examples of foreign influence have you observed that echo these historical patterns? Your insights in the comments help all of us see these cycles more clearly. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forces that constrain and shape revolutionary change. This is Cycles Decoded. Until we meet again to explore the patterns that connect us across time and place, I wish you a peaceful and reflective night.